He said, "Can I stay in your cabin just for one night? I traveled 3,000 acres through your ranch. It is too big," the widow whispered. "Then stay and take care of it and me." The words hung gently in the evening air as the last gold light of the Wyoming sunset spread across the prairie. Silas Kane sat motionless on his tired horse and studied the woman standing in the doorway. He had crossed deserts, rivers, and mountain passes during his years in the West, but he had never encountered anything quite like this place. For 6 long days, he had ridden through ranchland that seemed endless. Every morning he expected to reach a boundary fence, a river crossing, or a neighboring property. Instead, the land kept unfolding before him like an ocean of grass. Herds of cattle grazed in distant fields. Windmills turned slowly against the sky. Orchards appeared and disappeared along the horizon. Yet no matter how far he traveled, the ranch continued. Now at last he had reached its center. The cabin before him was simple and white, with a wide porch and flower boxes beneath the windows. It was not a mansion. It was not the grand residence he expected the owner of such a vast property to possess. More surprising was everything around it. Dozens of houses stretched across the nearby valley. Children played near wooden walkways. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lamps glowed behind curtains. The settlement looked lively and prosperous. Yet the people behaved strangely. As Silas had ridden into view, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Men, women, and children watched him from a distance. None approached the cabin. None crossed the open ground surrounding it. It was as though an invisible circle separated the widow from everyone else. "You own all this?" Silas asked. The woman nodded. "Most days I feel like it owns me instead." For the first time, Silas noticed how young she looked, 30 at most. Her dark hair was pinned neatly behind her head. Her blue dress was plain but elegant. There was kindness in her face, yet beneath it rested a loneliness so deep that even a stranger could recognize it. Silas removed his hat. "My name is Silas. Julia Hartwell." She offered a small smile. "Your horse looks more tired than you do." "He's earned a roof." "Then bring him to the stable." Silas expected questions. Most people recognized him sooner or later. Stories about the famous Gunman had traveled throughout the territories for years. Some called him the fastest draw in the West. Others called him the most dangerous man alive. Julia asked none of those questions. She simply led him toward the stable. That alone made him curious. Inside, the stable was spotless. Fresh hay filled the stalls. Silas carefully removed his saddle and brushed his horse. When he finished, he found Julia waiting outside with a lantern. "Supper is ready," she said. The cabin felt warm and welcoming. A kettle steamed over the stove. Fresh bread rested on the table beside roasted vegetables and slices of beef. The meal smelled better than anything Silas had eaten in weeks. "You prepared all this yourself?" he asked. Julia laughed softly. When a person lives alone, cooking becomes a habit. The answer seemed simple, yet something about it bothered him. No one truly lived alone here. An entire neighborhood surrounded the cabin. As they ate, conversation flowed easily. Julia spoke about the weather, livestock, harvest schedules, and orchard yields. She knew every corner of the ranch. Numbers and details came to her effortlessly. Yet whenever the discussion drifted toward the nearby families, she changed the subject. Silas noticed. He simply chose not to press. After supper, he stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The sun had nearly disappeared. Across the settlement, lamps flickered inside homes. Then something unusual happened. One by one, shutters closed. A woman pulled curtains across a front window. A shopkeeper locked his door. Children disappeared indoors. Within minutes, every house facing Julia's cabin had turned dark. Silas frowned. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. He watched in silence until Julia joined him. "You noticed," she said quietly. "Hard not to." She stared toward the distant homes. "It happens every evening. Why?" For a moment he thought she might answer. Instead, she shook her head. "Some questions grow heavier when they're explained. That sounds like a reason. It sounds like experience." Silas leaned against a porch post. The prairie wind carried the scent of grass and distant apple trees. "You don't seem angry." "About what?" "The way they avoid you." Julia considered the question. "Anger takes energy. I used mine elsewhere." "Where?" "Keeping this ranch alive." Her voice remained calm, but the sadness behind it became impossible to miss. Silas suddenly understood something. The greatest burden she carried was not the land. It was the silence. 3,000 acres could be measured. Loneliness could not. Later that evening, Julia showed him a small guest room. The furnishings were simple but comfortable. "You can leave at sunrise," she said. That was the plan. Good. Yet she did not sound pleased, neither did he. After she closed the door, Silas sat beside the window. Moonlight covered the valley. The houses remained quiet, no voices. No music, no laughter, only the wind. Something was wrong here, not dangerous, not criminal, something sadder. A mystery built from years of misunderstanding. Silas had spent much of his life recognizing threats. He knew the difference between fear and guilt. The people in the settlement did not look afraid of Julia. They looked ashamed. The thought lingered in his mind. Before breakfast ended, an elderly mail carrier passed along the road. He tipped his hat respectfully toward Julia, then hurried onward without stopping. A young boy carrying a basket did the same. So did a pair of ranch hands. Each offered kindness from afar, yet none crossed the open space between themselves and the cabin. The pattern puzzled Silas even more. People who disliked someone stayed away completely. These people seemed to care. That difference, he suspected, meant everything there. Near midnight, he finally slept. At dawn, he awoke to the smell of coffee and fresh bread. He dressed quickly and stepped outside. Julia stood near the porch rail, watching the sunrise paint the prairie gold. His horse was ready. His saddle was packed. Everything suggested it was time to leave, yet neither moved. "You've traveled far," Julia said. "I have. Then one more day won't matter much." Silas looked across the valley. A few residents had already emerged from their homes. Several glanced toward the cabin before looking away. The mystery remained, so did the loneliness in Julia's eyes. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose one more day won't matter at all." For the first time since he arrived, her smile reached her eyes. And without realizing it, the most famous gunman in the West made a decision that would change the course of his life. He had come seeking shelter for a single night. Instead, he chose to stay long enough to discover why an entire community had abandoned the woman at its heart. Morning settled gently over the valley as sunlight stretched across the endless fields. Silas had expected another quiet day before continuing his journey west, yet something inside him insisted that leaving now would feel unfinished. He had crossed thousands of acres without understanding why the heart of such a thriving ranch seemed wrapped in silence. The answer, he believed, lived somewhere among the people who watched Julia from a distance. After breakfast, Julia handed him a folded map showing grazing lands, orchards, mills, and tenant homes. "If you wish to see the ranch," she said, "follow any road. They all belong to the same story." Silas smiled. "That sounds like advice instead of directions. Sometimes they are the same." He saddled his horse and rode toward the nearest cluster of homes. Children playing beneath a cottonwood tree paused to wave. Their smiles came easily, but when he mentioned Julia, they lowered their voices. "She always waves," one little girl said. "We wave back," another answered. "Why don't you visit her?" Silas asked. The children exchanged uncertain glances before running off toward school. Their silence echoed louder than their laughter. Farther along the road, Silas stopped beside a weathered grain mill where an elderly man adjusted a wooden water wheel. The old miller greeted him warmly and offered cool water from a hand pump. "You're staying with Miss Julia," the miller observed. "For now. She deserves better than quiet." Silas leaned against the fence. "Then why does everyone leave her alone?" The miller sighed deeply. "We thought we were protecting her. From what? Ourselves." The answer only deepened the mystery. Throughout the afternoon, Silas visited orchards, grazing fields, workshops, and a small schoolhouse. Everywhere he found the same pattern. People spoke kindly of Julia. They admired her fairness, honesty, and generosity. No one criticized her. No one feared her. Yet no one visited her cabin. Near sunset, he entered the modest church standing at the edge of the settlement. The pastor welcomed him inside and noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. "You have questions," the pastor said. "I've gathered plenty. Then perhaps today is the day for answers." The pastor unlocked a small wooden cabinet and removed several worn ledgers. These belonged to Julia's husband, Thomas Hartwell. Silas carefully opened the first book. Each page listed names of families across the ranch. Beside every name appeared notes about cattle, seed, tools, medical bills, school supplies, and winter firewood. None of the entries demanded repayment. Instead, each ended with nearly identical words, "Given freely." Silas turned another page, then another. The pattern continued for years. Thomas had quietly helped nearly every family living on the ranch. No announcements, no contracts, no public praise, only quiet generosity. When Thomas died, the pastor explained, many believed Julia inherited every debt along with the ranch. So they avoided her. They wanted to repay everything before facing her. Silas frowned, but she never asked. She never even knew. Silas closed the ledger slowly. And Julia. She believed people blamed her for inheriting the ranch. 2 years of silence suddenly made heartbreaking sense. Neither side wished to burden the other. Kindness had somehow become loneliness. Leaving the church, Silas stood beneath the evening sky thinking about all the battles he had survived. None compared to this invisible distance between neighbors who cared for one another but feared causing pain. His revolver offered no answer. Conversation did. The following morning he visited the schoolteacher. "What does the community enjoy most?" he asked. She smiled. "Harvest suppers. When was the last one?" Her smile faded. "The year Thomas passed away." Silas tipped his hat. "Perhaps it's time for another." Word spread quickly. Instead of ordering people together, Silas simply invited them. Every family contributed something small. Bakers prepared fresh bread. Orchard workers gathered apples and peaches. Ranch hands offered beef. Children decorated long wooden tables with wildflowers gathered from nearby meadows. Julia knew nothing about the plan. She spent the afternoon reviewing ranch accounts inside the cabin while the entire settlement quietly worked together. As sunset approached, Silas knocked gently on her door. "I'd like to show you something." She followed him toward the open square. When they reached the hill overlooking the neighborhood, Julia stopped walking. Long tables stretched across the grass. Lanterns glowed softly. Families stood waiting. Children smiled nervously. No one spoke. Finally, the elderly miller stepped forward. "We owe you an apology." Julia looked confused. "For what?" "For disappearing." A ranch woman wiped tears from her eyes. "We thought you expected every debt repaid before we could face you." Julia stared in disbelief. "What debts?" The pastor carried forward Thomas's ledger. "These." She opened the worn book. Page after page revealed gifts she had never known about. Her husband had shared nearly everything he earned helping neighbors through difficult years. Julia's hands trembled. "He never told me." "He didn't tell anyone," the pastor replied. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different, not empty, hopeful. Julia looked across the gathered families. "I believed you blamed me." The schoolteacher shook her head. "We blamed ourselves." A little boy stepped forward holding a small basket of fresh apples. "My mother said these belong at your table." Julia accepted the basket with watery eyes. "Thank you." Another family offered homemade jam. Someone else carried flowers. The gifts were simple. Their meaning was enormous. As music from a fiddle drifted across the square, conversations slowly replaced years of quiet misunderstanding. Laughter returned. Children raced between tables. Neighbors who had avoided one another's sorrow finally shared it together. Standing slightly apart, Silas watched without seeking attention. Julia walked over beside him. "You knew," she said softly. "I suspected. And instead of telling everyone, you brought everyone together. I've learned people believe truth more easily when they discover it together." She smiled warmly. "You're different from the stories." Silas glanced toward the horizon. "So I've been told." She studied him carefully. "Who are you really?" He hesitated before answering. "A traveler trying to become a better man than yesterday." Julia nodded thoughtfully. "For the first time in a long while," she whispered, "this ranch feels like home again." Silas looked across the lanternlit valley, where neighbors lingered together long after supper ended, and quietly wondered whether peace could accomplish what reputation never had. For years, people had called him the most powerful gunman in the West, believing strength came from speed and fear. Yet standing there beneath the bright evening stars, surrounded by grateful families rediscovering one another, he felt stronger than he ever had with a revolver at his side. Somewhere deep inside, another journey had quietly begun, one leading not across endless prairie, but toward the life he had never imagined possible before. The weeks that followed transformed the valley in ways no one could have imagined. The silence that had once settled over Julia's ranch each evening gradually gave way to cheerful conversation, music drifting through open windows, and children laughing along the dusty roads. No miracle had changed the land itself. The orchard still demanded careful tending. The cattle still wandered across distant pastures. The grain mills still turned with the steady rhythm of flowing water. What had changed were the people who called the ranch home. Families no longer hurried indoors when the sun began to set. Instead, neighbors gathered beneath the wide cottonwood trees near Julia's cabin, sharing meals, stories, and plans for the coming seasons. Someone always brought fresh bread. Someone else carried fruit from the orchards. Musicians arrived with fiddles and guitars, filling the evening air with familiar tunes that had gone unheard for far too long. Julia welcomed everyone with genuine warmth. Her porch, once the loneliest place on 3,000 acres, became the busiest. Children raced across the yard chasing one another while older ranch hands swapped stories from earlier days. Women exchanged recipes and gardening tips. Young couples planned weddings beneath the shade of ancient trees. Every visitor left feeling lighter than when they arrived. Silas quietly watched these gatherings from the edge of the porch. He rarely stood at the center of attention. Instead, he helped where needed. He repaired wagon wheels, organized supplies before harvest, taught young riders how to calm frightened horses, and listened whenever someone needed advice. His reputation slowly faded behind his actions. Many newcomers to the settlement knew him simply as Silas, nothing more, nothing less. One afternoon, Julia found him sitting beside the creek, skipping smooth stones across the water. "You look peaceful," she observed. "I'm learning how." She sat beside him. "Do you miss your old life?" Silas watched another stone bounce across the surface before disappearing beneath gentle ripples. "I miss parts of it." "Which parts?" "The open trails. And the rest. I don't miss being remembered only for the worst stories people told." Julia nodded knowingly. "It's difficult living inside someone else's version of your life." He smiled. "You understand that better than anyone." The days passed with comfortable rhythm. As autumn approached, ranch workers gathered to prepare for harvest. Unlike previous years, every family volunteered without being asked. The orchards filled with laughter as neighbors worked side by side. Even children found small ways to help, carefully carrying baskets of apples and peaches toward waiting wagons. Watching them, Julia remembered how empty those same orchards had once felt. Now they overflowed with life. One evening, the pastor approached Silas carrying an old wooden box discovered while cleaning the church attic. "We found something belonging to Thomas," he explained. Inside rested journals, maps, and folded letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Julia carefully untied the bundle. Among the papers lay one unopened envelope bearing her name. Her hands trembled. "I've never seen this." The pastor shook his head. "It must have been misplaced after the funeral." Julia unfolded the letter slowly. Thomas's familiar handwriting filled every page. He wrote about ordinary things first: the changing seasons, the growing orchards, and his hope that the settlement would continue helping one another long after he was gone. Near the end, his words became deeply personal. "My dearest Julia," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then I was not given the years I hoped for. You have always believed strength means carrying every burden yourself. I have learned the opposite. Real strength is allowing good people to stand beside you. Promise me you will never mistake loneliness for independence. This ranch was never meant to belong to one person. It belongs to every heart willing to care for it together." Tears slipped quietly down Julia's cheeks. Around her, the gathered neighbors listened in respectful silence. When she finished reading, she looked across the familiar faces surrounding her. "For 2 years," she whispered, "I believed I had to protect all of you." The elderly miller smiled gently, "And we believed exactly the same." Soft laughter spread through the crowd. This time no misunderstanding remained between them, only gratitude. Later that evening, as lanterns glowed beneath the stars, the community voted unanimously to create a yearly gathering honoring Thomas's generosity. Rather than celebrating ownership of the ranch, they would celebrate kindness, cooperation, and friendship. Julia accepted the idea with humble appreciation. "This belongs to everyone," she said. "So does tomorrow." The following morning, Silas quietly packed his saddle before sunrise. Old habits returned whenever life became comfortable. He believed staying too long might eventually burden those around him. His horse stood ready near the stable. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the eastern hills. Just as he tightened the final strap, Julia stepped outside carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I thought I might find you here." Silas accepted the cup. "I didn't want to wake anyone." "You wouldn't have." They stood together in peaceful silence, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the fields. Finally, Julia asked, "Have you traveled enough?" Silas looked across the endless ranch that had once seemed impossibly large. When he first arrived, every mile represented distance. Now every mile reminded him of connection. "For the first time," he answered softly, "I think I have." Julia smiled. Then perhaps you should stop packing. He laughed quietly. I suppose that would help. She reached into her apron pocket and removed a small iron key. What's this? He asked. The spare key to the cabin. Silas stared at it. You trust me with your home? Julia gently placed the key in his hand. I'm trusting you because you already made it one. His eyes glistened. Few words had ever meant more. Months passed. Winter arrived gently, covering the distant hills with a light blanket of snow while leaving the roads open and welcoming. Smoke curled from chimneys each morning. The annual gathering became the happiest tradition the settlement had ever known. Families shared meals, music, and stories celebrating neighbors who quietly helped others throughout the year. Visitors traveling across Wyoming often paused in surprise when they reached the enormous ranch. Instead of hearing tales about a lonely widow or a feared gunman, they discovered a thriving community built upon generosity and trust. If they asked who owned the 3,000 acres, people smiled before answering. We all care for it. And if they asked about the quiet man helping children learn to ride horses, someone would simply say, that's Silas. No titles followed, no fearful whispers remained. One evening, long after another joyful gathering ended, Silas and Julia sat together on the familiar porch, watching the sunset spread across the endless prairie. The breeze carried the laughter of children returning home, the distant melody of a fiddle, and the comforting sounds of neighbors wishing one another good night. Julia leaned back in her chair and smiled. You only asked to stay one night. Silas looked across the land that had once seemed too vast for any single heart. Then he looked at the woman beside him. It turns out, he said with quiet gratitude, it took 3,000 acres to finally find home. As the last light faded beyond the horizon, neither of them wished to be anywhere else, because the greatest journey either had ever taken had ended exactly where belonging began.